Dennis Murphy, Ray and Faye Copeland. In the late 1980s, drifters passing through the livestock auctions of northern Missouri sometimes heard about an old farmer who was hiring. Ray Copeland was in his 70s, stooped and hard of hearing, and he worked his land outside Chillicothe with his wife Faye, a small, quiet woman who kept the house and did the laundry. The job Ray offered was simple. A man down on his luck would live on the farm, open a bank account in his own name, and buy cattle at auction with checks Ray provided. The checks were bad. By the time they bounced, the cattle were sold, and the drifter had moved on. That was the scheme on paper. In October 1989, acting on a tip from a former hired man, agents brought a backhoe to farms where Ray had worked. They found the bodies of 5 drifters, including 27-year-old Dennis Murphy, each shot with the same rifle from Ray's closet. Inside the farmhouse, investigators found something else, a handwritten list of the farm's hired men, with small marks next to certain names. Every marked name belonged to a man in the ground. The men had been perfect victims, transients with no families checking on them, hired precisely because no one would come looking. Ray was 75 when he was sentenced to death. Faye was 69, and she became the oldest woman ever sentenced to death in the United States. She insisted to the end that she had only cooked and cleaned and asked no questions. But jurors could not get past one piece of evidence found in the farmhouse. A handmade quilt, neatly stitched by Faye, pieced together from the clothing of the murdered men. Ray died awaiting execution in 1993. Faye's sentence was eventually commuted, and she died in 2003. The oldest couple ever sent to death row in America had spent their golden years hiring the forgotten and burying them. The Men in the Planters, Bruce McArthur. In the summers of the 2010s, one of the most requested landscapers in Toronto was a heavy-set, white-bearded man in his 60s named Bruce McArthur. Clients loved him. He played Santa Claus at a shopping mall at Christmas. And for 7 years, men had been disappearing from the neighborhood known as the Gay Village, most of them immigrants. Men from Turkey, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, men whose absences were easy for officials to explain away. The community insisted a predator was hunting them. A police review found nothing, and the disappearances continued. It took the 2017 disappearance of Andrew Kinsman, a well-known and well-loved volunteer whose friends refused to let his case fade, to break it open. Andrew was organized, the kind of man who wrote things down, and in his apartment, investigators found a calendar entry for the day he vanished. It said, simply, Bruce. In January 2018, detectives finally closed in, and what they found redefined the case. McArthur had killed at least 8 men between 2010 and 2017, beginning when he was 58 years old, and he had hidden their remains where no one thought to look, inside large decorative planters he maintained at clients' properties across the city. The evidence gardens he had planted and watered for years became crime scenes, excavated in the Toronto winter with heaters thawing the soil. He pleaded guilty in 2019, at 67, to 8 counts of first-degree murder, one of the oldest serial killers ever convicted in Canada, and was sentenced to life with no parole eligibility for 25 years, meaning the earliest he could apply would be at 91. The review that followed forced the city to answer an uncomfortable question. How does a man kill for 7 years in the middle of a major city? Part of the answer was who his victims were, and part of it was that nobody looks twice at a grandfatherly gardener. Grace Budd, Albert Fish. On May 28, 1928, a frail, gray-haired man calling himself Frank Howard visited the Budd family in Manhattan, answering an ad placed by their 18-year-old son, who was looking for farm work. The old man seemed gentle and devout. He charmed the parents, and when he mentioned a birthday party his sister was hosting uptown, he offered to take their 10-year-old daughter Grace along for the evening. Her mother dressed her in her Sunday best. Grace left holding the old man's hand, and she never came back. There was no farm, no sister, and no party, and the man was not Frank Howard. He was Albert Fish, a house painter and father of 6, 58 years old at the time, with a face like everyone's grandfather, and a long, hidden history of harming children. For 6 years, the case sat open, until 1934, when Fish could not resist mailing the Budd family an anonymous letter describing what he had done. What that letter contained will not be repeated here. What matters is the envelope. Its stationery carried a faint printed emblem, which a detective named William King traced to a company, then to a boarding house whose landlady remembered a polite elderly lodger. King staked out the room for weeks, and when the frail old man finally shuffled in for his tea, he came along quietly, as if he had been waiting years for the knock. He was 64, and he had razor blades hidden on him even then. Fish confessed to Grace's murder and to crimes against other children, and alienists who examined him concluded he was among the most damaged human beings they had ever studied. A jury found him sane enough. In January 1936, at 65, Albert Fish was executed at Sing Sing, the oldest man ever put to death there. The Buds had trusted him for the oldest reason in the world. He looked harmless. Samuel Little. In September 2012, officers arrested a 72-year-old drifter at a homeless shelter in Kentucky on an old drug warrant out of California. He was a former boxer, huge through the shoulders even in old age, and his name was Samuel Little. A routine DNA swab connected him to 3 unsolved murders of women in Los Angeles from the late 1980s. That alone would have made him a footnote, one more aging killer caught by the database. A jury convicted him in 2014 of the 3 Los Angeles murders, strangled women whose cases had sat cold for a quarter century, and he went to prison insisting he had never killed anyone. Then, in 2018, in a Texas interview room, a ranger named James Holland sat down with him, brought him food, spoke to him without disgust, and asked. And Samuel Little began to talk. He talked for months. He confessed in the end to 93 murders committed across the United States between 1970 and 2005, in 19 states, over 35 years. He remembered his victims not by name but by place and detail, and he drew them, portrait after portrait in colored pencil, faces the FBI released to the public in the hope that someone, somewhere, would recognize a missing sister or mother. Investigators confirmed 60 of the confessions, enough for the FBI to name him the most prolific serial killer in American history. His method explains his invisibility. He chose women on the margins and he strangled, leaving no wounds, so that again and again the deaths were ruled overdoses or natural causes and never counted as murder at all. He was never suspected in his 30s, never suspected in his 50s, and was finally understood at 78, an old man in a wheelchair in a prison interview room, sketching the dead from memory. He died in 2020, with dozens of his portraits still unmatched. The youngest killers violate our sense of innocence. The oldest violate something quieter, the assumption that danger retires. A stooped farmer, a mall Santa landscaper, a frail grandfather at the door, a sick old man in a wheelchair. Every system built to catch predators is calibrated to look for someone in their prime. Witnesses describe young men. Profiles assume young men. Juries struggle to convict a defendant who shuffles to the stand. Every one of these killers slipped through that same blind spot, some of them for half a century. We are trained to see the elderly as people to protect. Nobody is trained to be protected from them.